I think what I want to do is to get stuck straight in to these questions. Broadly, no one gave their name, or one person gave their name, so I'm not going to refer to anybody in particular. I've tried to aggregate a bit of questions, and to start off by focusing perhaps really on the theme of the conference, which is the Judaizing Palestine, exactly. Because this is going to be intended to be the strategy for ICAHD going forward. Indeed, one of the questions that came in is how will reframing the question as Judaizing Palestine impact on Israel's supporters, partners in the governance of the world, and how will this make them change their approach? And I must say that this is a question that came to my mind as well. That although absolutely right in saying this word Judaization is something Judaizing which comes from Israeli discourse itself, going back decades actually. Nonetheless, you can see that this as a word being used outside of Israel-Palestine as something which is going to raise various kinds of alarm bells. So I think that's an important question which you might address first of all, Jeff, and see how you respond to that.
Well, the use of the word Judaization.
Yeah.
Well, let me say first of all, it's connected. But to relate to a little bit to what Salma was talking about as well, we've tried all over the years to use international IHL, international law, and human rights covenants as mechanisms of advocacy. And we've gone to the courts in certain cases, and we've tried to find ways to bring house demolition cases and other ones to courts under universal jurisdiction, and there's been a whole pulling back from that of many governments. So we've tried to do that a lot, and I think I agree that it's very important. But there's other things that are happening on the ground that don't have a reference to international law. The strength of things like apartheid, using the word apartheid, occupation, and so on, is that they do have a reference. I mean, there's teeth to those concepts. You could take violators to court. There's supposed to be sanctions. There's laws, but there's other processes going on that we wanted to sort of give a legitimacy to or to articulate that are important, but don't necessarily have that redress to international law or to courts, or don't have a legal reference. One of them is Judaization. And I think Judaization is a very powerful concept. It's true, it can be misinterpreted. That's why we have to explain it well. But, we had the same problem with apartheid and a lot of other terminologies that people weren't comfortable with in the beginning. And that's part of it, is getting people used to this. But Judaization, of course, is a term that's actually used by Israel, as I said. So it's not something made up. And the powerful part of Judaization is that it puts the responsibility on Israel. And that's really an important part of the whole political equation. And that is that, because Israel, and Salma talked about this, that Israel brilliantly uses its status as a victim. And of course that dovetails with Jews as the ultimate victims. As a way of avoiding accountability. And so as long as Israel sees the victim, in a way it's off the hook. So Judaization is a way of trying to nail Israel, to say, no, you're responsible for this situation. It's a proactive policy and campaign. And to change the whole dynamic, that's the idea behind my book as well. My book on Israel and the arms trade is to try to change the image of Israel from being a victim to being a tremendously powerful country, militarily and politically. Because if we can start to change that image of Israel, then we have a much stronger case for holding Israel accountable. In other words, as long as Israel can present itself as the victim, and politicians can present Israel as the victim, it's off the hook. And so I think those campaigns, the arms campaign, plus this idea of Judaization is important, even though, again, it's a term that doesn't have a reference in international law. Another term, just to mention, that we're also using a lot, and we're trying to get people to use, even though it has no legal reference, is warehousing. Warehousing, which is a form of imprisonment, is actually coming out of the world of prisons. And I think the Palestinian people is being warehoused. So those are terms, that are kind of to accompany a campaign of using international law and human rights. Are campaigns that take concepts like Judaization and warehousing that are important processes, even though they don't have a legal reference.
Can I bring Salma in here then? Because what you're arguing is this is a way of calling Israel to account by using this term. And I wonder, Salma, how you feel about that in relation to international law, because actually one could say the same thing about that international law is the way to call Israel to account. There have been a couple of questions that have come in which are a bit more specific on this, which raise the question of how fixed is international law. So in other words, if you're going to call Israel to account on international law, are there fixed reference points in that law which can be used? Because someone writes here that I recall an Israeli stating it evolved by violations, things that were violations, if they're repeated sufficiently, can become accepted practice. I've heard this myself about somebody arguing that actually settlers have got human rights as well, and that they've developed over time. So I wonder how you feel about that.
It's a really good question, and thanks to whoever raised it, because we didn't have a chance to go into it. But certainly, so on sort of the second question first, which is international law fixed? The answer is no, and that really its Achilles heel is the fact that partly international law is formed of what's state practice, so what do states do, and what do states say they think is the law, as well as the treaties, which perhaps are a little bit more fixed because they're kind of written down and signed. And the difficulty with that, with the question of state practice, is that, of course, and this is what I think it was the previous head of the International Law Department, which is a unit in the Israeli army of lawyers, military lawyers, what he had said is that the law evolves through violations, I think is the quote. Meaning, in other words, if we keep breaking international humanitarian law and recasting its rules in a kind of self-legitimizing manner, if enough people, other countries in the world also start to think, oh, this is quite useful for us, for example, in our wars on terror and so on, then eventually you could get a kind of remoulding of those rules. And in fact, that's another part of Israel's strategy in terms of pushing back at Palestinians' use of the law is to do this. It's what I would call actually true lawfare, which is trying to actually change the rules of IHL in their favour. But what I would say to that as well is not to get kind of too worried about it. On the one hand, most states are not adopting those kind of new ways of looking at the law, and so long, really, and this is again the role of lawyers and also political activists and everyone around the world, so long as that we keep, as far as possible, holding Israel to account on the rules as they are now, we will be able to stem that tide, which Israel is trying to. We'll be able to stem that approach. But the other thing I wanted to say is also there's a tendency, especially amongst lawyers and perhaps amongst activists, to kind of try to use the law to focus very much just on international humanitarian law, and this is the law that Israel is trying to change. But there are whole other bodies of law which I think are less susceptible. They're much less forgiving, as it were, of occupiers and of armies. That's just international humanitarian law that's like that. We have international human rights law. We have other legal concepts that Jeff mentioned, like apartheid and colonialism, which, really, I think it's a combination of these approaches that need to be used. And there is, in fact, sorry, I'm going on and on, but just for those who are interested, there is a drive now amongst Palestinian lawyers to start to, who have recognised that just looking at the occupation and occupation law and IHL is limiting, and there needs to be a new legal framework which better describes the reality that we face, which is essentially of one sort of Israeli regime which exists and expresses itself over the entire country. And they've proposed this new framework, apartheid, colonialism and forced population transfer, and that describes what happened up to 1948 within Israel proper and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So, I think that the law is very malleable. It's indeterminate, which can be used against us, but it also means that we can have a role in shaping it and then thinking about the kinds of legal frameworks that we apply. And so, in a sense, it's a kind of it's a living thing, and it will keep evolving with us.
Thank you. You take us in really to the next point in a way, because you're sort of referring there to what is now, and just spoke a lot about this morning, the de facto one-state situation in Israel-Palestine. That's the reality today. I want to move into that, but maybe do it slightly, not backwards, but sort of sideways, because obviously, if there is no point in pursuing any war, the idea of a two-state is entirely dead. Where does that leave, this comes to the question here, where does that leave the efforts that are being made to try and persuade our British government here and other governments to recognise a Palestinian state? Is this something that's still worth pursuing? And so maybe even ask Khalil first, whether you, for example, feel that the pursuit of recognition of a Palestinian state is of any value, and is it of any value within your frame of international law? Is that something which should be continued? Khalil, what do you think?
That's interesting, really. I think it's connected to the first part that Jeff talked about, whether we will have a one-state solution or two. But if Israel recognized the independent state that live beside Israel in peace in the future, I think the main struggle, the main debate will move, the center of all this debate may move maybe to the Israeli Arab minority, the Palestinian minority like me, and the other 1.5 million Palestinians who live in Israel and hold the Israeli passport ID. Will be, I think, a more civil debate, civil struggle that talk about equal rights and more recognition of the villages and recognized villages. I don't know if it would be developed more for national rights, recognition as a national minority, independent rights like education, separate education system, separate many separate or independent rule like the Palestinian Authority today in a very minimum way or form. But these are all really theoretical ways or thoughts that raising now. I think it all depends. If we want to summarize that, it all depends on the development in the future and what happens with the occupied Palestinian territories. What would be the final solution for that? Final solution in many ways. If it happens, I think it will definitely influence the way of our struggle in the future as Israeli citizens, Palestinian Israeli citizens. I think the recognition of the villages issue will be the main issue. Will continue being the main issue in at least in the local level of the Israeli state.
Sure. Salma, so what do you think about the recognition of Palestine in terms of international law? Is that?
I think these recognitions are political acts, we have to remember that. But the legal consequence of them is, I think, in a sense, it's a good thing in the short run, because all it really does is it on the one hand, it constitutes, I think, a recognition by these states that Palestinians have the right to self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza. And although that's, in a sense, a limited goal, it's better than nothing, as I said, when we look at the colonization that's happening. So it's useful in that sense. It's useful in the sense that it adds to the body of law, which is really making it now pretty much irrefutable that Palestine is a state for legal purposes. And again, the only usefulness of that is not how it affects the situation on the ground, but it means that Palestine has available to it various kind of mechanisms and recourse that would not otherwise be available to it, such as membership in international bodies, such as being able to call on the assistance of other states as a state, being able to carry out that diplomatic act. But if I could just take the opportunity to also address, which I think is really the interesting point about these state recognitions, and perhaps is a reason why there's some reticence towards them from different parts of kind of the movement, is because of this whole kind of issue of international law, which seems to presuppose a two-state solution, and the kind of one-state solution, which we might either favour or we might think is really inevitable now, given the situation on the ground. And Jeff and I were on a programme with Norman Finkelstein when this came up, if you remember, a few months ago. I just would like to say, just very briefly, I do think that it probably is correct that there isn't a way to say that the one-state solution is legally mandated or compulsory in some sense. It can't necessarily be enforced on Israel as a matter of law. I accept that. Whereas the question of there being a Palestinian state next to Israel, in a sense, is more enforceable as a matter of law. But I don't think that the law precludes a one-state solution. I think the one-state solution and the two-state solution, these are both political solutions which seek to ensure that legal principles are upheld, the legal principles that there are, which are things like self-determination, right of return, human rights, etc. So anyway, it's kind of the elephant in the room, I think, often in these discussions, and I just wanted to say that's my view on it.
Yeah, okay.
One solution is both of us can live with Jeff at the same neighborhood.
Yeah. I saw that program actually with you debating with Norman Finkelstein. It was quite something. So you can still find it on YouTube. It's worth watching. But let's carry on then on this question of one state, two state, because Jeff this morning made a very strong case in terms of ICAHD's position, really, I suppose, of embracing what you call the other side of the BDS equation, the binational democratic state. But you also raised, and this comes up in the question, that it's very difficult to tell the Palestinians that this is the solution that they should have. The Palestinians have to decide for themselves about this, and it's a particularly delicate moment for this kind of thing, because of issues to do with normalization and so on. So someone asked, well, how do we address the Palestinians on the idea of one democratic state? Is there some way that one can do that? And I'd add there also that and I feel great sympathy with the idea of impressing upon people the notion that there is now this de facto one state, an oppressive regime and so on. And it's very, and I indeed in my book, which published in 2012, I wrote in 2011, I wrote about it there, that this is the reality. But do you see some difficulty going from describing a negative reality, one state, and then trying to turn that into something, suddenly say, well, actually it can be positive? I mean, there's a sort of big conceptual leap there. So, Jeff, maybe you could address those.
Well, again, coming from as a political organization and trying to read the realities on the ground and the political policies, my position is that there is one state today, like I mentioned this morning. There is one state, de facto. One government, one water system, one highway system, one electrical system, one currency, one army, by every measure. But it's one state that is today an apartheid regime. I mean, even in its laws and everything. And I would say even worse than apartheid in terms of warehousing. So it seems to me that, I don't know, I'm not a good mathematician, that's why I'm an anthropologist. But it seems to me that there's three options, unless you take out, there's 5 options maybe to resolving this. 2 of them I kind of remove. One is that all the Jews, Algeria, and all the Jews have to go home, wherever that is. That I don't accept. And the other one is, of course, that we throw all the Arabs into the sea, or they all disappear or leave. I think those 2 are non-starters, at least in my point of view. Which means that there's 3 options left. One is a 2-state solution. I mean, I don't eliminate that conceptually or even politically or legally. I just say that it's gone. I mean, now you don't have to agree with me. So there are still people that think it's alive, so that's an option for them. I think it's gone. Which means that the second option, the realistic option, is apartheid and warehousing, which we have today. And Israel believes that it's won. Israel thinks it can sustain apartheid warehousing as it is today pretty much indefinitely. That the world won't go, like I said, that justice gap. The world might criticize the occupation, but it's not going to go to a real just one-state solution. That's just inconceivable. And then the third, but that's unacceptable to us, obviously, the apartheid warehousing. So for us, it seems to me, by us I mean the movement, even though it hasn't been articulated yet by Palestinians very clearly, it seems to me that a one-state solution, but a just one-state solution of equal rights for everyone, is the only option left. I mean, almost mathematically, you can close down the other ones. And it's the only one left, and we have to start formulating it. But again, the problem is that in a sense, this has to be a Palestinian-led movement. And so, so let me just say just one thing. I think today, you can't get there. You're not going to get to a one-state solution today. There's no movement possible for a couple of reasons. One of them being the Palestinian Authority. I'm not blaming the Palestinian Authority for creating the occupation, but its job is to keep the lid on. And it prevents any other voices, effective voices of Palestinians from emerging. So you have that. And then, of course, you have that. So I think what's going to happen, you've heard me say this before, and it's between wishful thinking and analysis, somewhere in that area. I think a collapse is coming. We have to factor in collapse. You can't get move, everything is stable state today, as long as it's a PA. But I think the PA is unsustainable, even in the short term. Abu Mazen's 80 years old. He doesn't have any more authority. He's not even ruling over anything anymore. He has no money. Israel and the U.S. and others take his money every 3 weeks. He has no credibility among his own people. I mean, the whole thing is just so, I think, unsustainable that I think it's going to collapse. And elections are impossible. And that collapse will be the game changer. Both because it'll give the Palestinian civil society that political space it needs to begin to formulate new ways out that it's having trouble doing today under this dead hand of the PA. And also because I think it would force Israel to reoccupy physically the Palestinian cities and Gaza. We couldn't allow that vacuum and it would create such an intolerable situation that it would begin to force the hand of the international community. So I think that's from my point of view the missing thing. If this collapse happens, all these things can really change, and then we have to be ready, which we're not. That's what I'm trying to push on. But if the collapse, until the collapse happens, there's really not so much we can actually do, I think.
Let me move then to that point to Khalil. What do you think about this idea that the PA may well collapse, and if it did collapse, how will that affect things, and particularly your concerns, the concerns of the Bedouin? Do you think that's going to have any impact on that at all?
I really don't see the direct link or connection exactly to the Palestinian Authority. just because we are separated now, we are in two separate areas. We are in a Nakab now. I'm talking about the Bedouin of the unrecognized villages in the south of Israel, in a Nakab area in the desert, and the Palestinian under the occupation in the occupied territories in Gaza and mainly in the West Bank. I think Israel always keep the separation between the Bedouin and the West Bank. They wanted always I don't know if I can call it the security strip between us and them. Sharon mentioned that several times, and others, that they don't want any link between the Bedouin geographically, between the Bedouin and Gaza from one side, and between the Bedouin and the West Bank. So they kept the Bedouin separated from many ways. If the Palestinian Authority collapse, I think something new. I agree with Jeff on that side. That's something new. I think it would be a new opportunity to create new leadership among the Palestinians. Something that lead Barghouti or one of the youngest, even that he is not young now, many years in the jail, Israeli jail, but something new will grow up, and a new solution have to be. I see the international community intervene and forcing this solution, because under this mess nobody can live, and without any regards to the Palestinians inside Israel, the Israeli Palestinian citizens like us, have to be a separate solution, and Israel have no courage, have no will, have no way to pursue with that, to continue with that, and I suggest and offer a fair solution or just solution with the Palestinians, and recognizing their ambition and their rights. So it must be dictated. I am sure of that, and I see that happening.
You see it happening. Well, I think one of the problems there is that the dictating the solution from outside hasn't worked up to now, with Hillary Clinton possibly coming.
Similar to Camp David with Egypt.
Even yes, but we'll see. There was a question Salma put about the differences between the younger generation and older generation of Palestinians, or between the younger generation and Palestinian leadership of two states, one state. I mean, we still, I think, getting opinion polls saying, well, Palestinians will support the two-state solution, but the point is being put that actually, when you ask people directly, is it going to happen? Do they really want it? They say no. So is that being transferred, do you think, to the idea of one democratic state? Do you think, and again, to draw you into this question of the PA, if the PA collapses, how will this affect things?
My impression about kind of generational divide, or at least a divide between the leadership and those who are sort of close to the leadership and everyone else, is that what's interesting. I think it's actually quite a complex answer, because I think it depends on the question that you ask people. I think generally that's one thing. What I'll say first, actually, is that the younger generation, I think, are more concerned about rights. And so are the kind of civil society movements you see, like the BDS campaign and the Stop the War campaign. What they tend to emphasize is rights over political solutions, and concepts that are to do with rights over political concepts. So, for example, they might emphasize whatever sort of configuration of powers that we live in, whether it's one or two states, we all want to be able to, have freedom of movement. We all want to be able to have access to healthcare, for example. Or they might talk about self-determination, which is the right to sort of, shape your own destiny, rather than the political outcome of statehood per se. So I think that's one differentiation, is that what I would call this renewed interest in rights regardless of political outcomes, as opposed to political outcomes which are kind of varying regardless of rights, in a way, which is perhaps the older generation. And I think the other thing, as I said, is it depends on the question you ask. because I had a really interesting opportunity to go around with a filmmaker it was a while ago, I think it was in 2011 in the West Bank, and he made a film. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the film or the filmmaker, but it did show in London about a year ago. And what it was about, this is a very interesting person because he was raised as an Orthodox Israeli Jew in a settlement and went from that position to become a kind of one-state person. And what he wanted to do is really inquire about what support is there within the Palestinian communities and amongst Israelis for this solution. And we asked, so we went around and did lots and lots of interviews, hundreds of interviews with different people in different towns in the West Bank, and asked the same 10 questions. And if you asked the question that said, do you believe there can be a one-state solution? Or do you want a one-state solution? A lot of people said, no, come on, that will never happen, they'll never accept us. At the end, the two-state solution is the only show in town. But if you asked another question which said, for example, how would you feel if you were allowed to go back to your homes that you were expelled from in Israel, but you had Israeli neighbours, Jewish neighbours next door, but you were allowed to be there and nobody was oppressing you? And people often said, oh, great, that's fantastic, we would definitely be happy with that. Or if you said to them, what's more important to you, the right of return or ending the occupation? Was another really interesting question. And a lot of time people said, well, the right of return is really what matters, which again, all of these things I think are indicators of the fact that what people want is a just one state reality, but we don't have a political movement that has properly articulated that for us and given us a way of thinking that that's achievable. And so people go to the default position as well, we're now in this two-state thing and that's what the support is there for, and so we can't really relinquish that. So that would be my sense of where Palestinians are.
Just move on to something slightly different here, and that is, I've had a couple of questions actually, about engaging Jewish communities outside Israel on the issues for which ICAHD campaigns. Obviously, ICAHD is not focusing specifically or at all on Jewish communities as such, but there are, of course, a lot of the Jews who feel it's important to, let's say, Jews who support ICAHD, who feel it's important to try and persuade diaspora Jews of all these arguments, and that would in itself have some impact. So I wondered, Jeff, what you think about engaging, whether it is something that ICAHD thinks it's important to do to engage Jewish communities, and how that might be done. So again, drawing on some of the questions, obviously it's not just recent, but racist statements by Israeli government ministers, for example, drawing attention to that kind of thing, having more focused critique of what happened last year in Gaza, for example, and these kinds of things which might help in this regard.
Well, we don't target so much the Jewish community abroad for the main reason because we'd never be invited in. It's not that we don't. We speak. As a matter of fact, when I was in Canada in February, and it's on the YouTube, the owner of the Jewish newspaper in Winnipeg, which is one of the major Jewish newspapers in Canada, it's called the Jewish Post and News, interviewed me in a cafe. It was a public interview, and he put it up on their website, and it went out from there. So there are some times, and when I was in Vancouver, I spoke at a more left, but a very Jewish forum, and I've spoken in synagogue. I mean, I have here and there managed to get in. So it's not that we don't try, but I think it's much better. In the States, you have, for example, the Jewish Voice for Peace. They're very good. They're very much with us, and we work together. But they don't use the same language we do, and they're BDS, but they're a little bit more gentle BDS, like SodaStream, things like that. So they are, and they're actually the fastest growing Jewish organization. In Canada, my tour was sponsored by Independent Jewish Voices, which is different than the one here, but it's a nationwide group in Canada. So I guess our strategy is really to be resource people and to work with the more left-leaning in political leadership, especially young people of the Jewish community, and then let them have more access directly into the Jewish community instead of going from us to an average Jewish audience is a huge leap. Our language is different and what we're asking. But if you just ask just in a second how we do it, the fact is, if I do get access to a mainstream Jewish group, I do very well. It's just I don't get access often. And part of it has to do with framing, which has always been part of our strategy. We have framings for Christian audiences and evangelical Christians and Catholics and for women's audiences and kids. And this framing idea is very good because it lets you pitch to your audience if you know what their language is and their concerns, and it starts to resonate. And for Jews all over, it's human rights. I mean, human rights is like we invented it. We own it. I mean, Jews very much identify with human rights and social rights as defining them. It's true. When it gets down to Palestine, it doesn't. But nevertheless, you do have that. And I think there is. I think Jews are really getting more and more mortified with Israel. There's other issues I won't get into now. But what we do is we emphasize the human rights part. So I say, for example, just in a sentence, there are two genuine heroes of the 20th century, Jewish heroes that you've never heard of. Boom, I've got them in my hand. The Jews love heroes. One of them is Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jew, a survivor of the Holocaust, who coined the term genocide. And he's the one that pushed the genocide conventions through the UN. And the other one is René Cassin, who was a Jewish jurist who teamed up with Eleanor Roosevelt and others. And he authored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's like the Thomas Jefferson of the world of human rights. Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1968. He's buried in the Pantheon with Voltaire and Rousseau. So now I've got him. If I would start with occupation, the room would have been empty. I start with these Jewish heroes of human rights, and they're with me. And now I back into the occupation, and they're kind of caught in their own petard of their, So there are strategies certainly for doing that. You've got to find the right language, but nevertheless, we don't. I can't really say the Jewish community has been a main target for us simply because we don't have access.
Sure, right. What do the two of you feel actually about the question of Jewish opinion? Does it figure in your thinking as something which is important to try and influence or impact in any way? Maybe Khalil first. And then
In the general opinion.
have you spoken to Jewish groups? And then, for example, there is one of the groups here, ICAHD, I think it is, sort of liberal Zionist groups. They, I believe, are making quite a big thing now of the Bedouin and the situation of the Bedouin. So I wonder whether have they invited you to speak to them?
No, not yet. I am always open to talk to everybody, including Netanyahu.
I think I can deliver ICAHD easier than that.
Unfortunately, we have a very, very small groups, Jewish groups that support our struggle. I think the mainstream in Israel is really get crazy, driven after the extremist way or path of the radical right wing that we have almost 20 years and more after the assassination of Rabin. And this, even the mainstream of the media is leading this path, and transfer it to the people. So they are always feeding by this trash, and start believing that this is the right policy. That the Bedouins are trespassers, they are invaders. They have no rights, no titles, nothing to do here with the land. And the land have to be redeemed. taken from those evil people and taken back to the state of Israel. State of Israel have the right to do everything with the land, but not the Bedouin. So this is the main thing that's going now. We are trying to conduct and contact many people as we can. There is very, very small groups that support our struggle. We have the NCF, the Negev Coexistence Forum, which is a grassroots group of Jews and Bedouins that work together. We have some really very, very, very small groups that work and support. Those who are really convinced and supporting the struggle, they are doing their best. They are always recruited and they are trying to recruit others and do. But if you participate, see one of our events in the Negev and the Nakab, you will see that there is very, very marginal groups, especially in the south. The south is very extremist, considered or compared to the Galilee area in the north or the middle Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is very open society, very liberal society. So I can see the cooperation with the Bedouin, and we can't really lie on that or count on that their support will help us overcome the obstacles and solve this plight of Bedouin.
I do think it's really important to address sort of Jewish groups and Jewish communities outside of Israel. I think one of the advantages of, again, using kind of a legal approach in advocacy is that it opens up, I think, the audiences you can speak to, in the sense that, there are many Jews who are lawyers in this country, and who have been prominent lawyers as well. So in a sense, they also, if you address them on legal principles, it's hard for them also to resist that, and opens up the audiences we can speak to. But of course, I think that legal advocacy is only a small part of all the advocacy that we should be doing. And I think in terms of wider issues, as Palestinians speaking to Jewish groups, it's a little bit awkward, I think, for Palestinians to do that, because I think they sort of may get themselves into a situation where they sort of feel they have to kind of sell themselves to, or make themselves acceptable to people that are really, whose allegiance is really with their oppressors. And so to an extent, I feel like it's not really our job as Palestinians, and I think it can create some resentment when we feel forced to do it, and to reframe it in a way that's kind of attractive or appealing to that audience. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen in the right situations, absolutely. And I also think it's really an important thing, and therefore it would be great for more Israeli Jews or non-Israeli Jews to do it. I really do think, if Jeff was saying that ICAHD don't have that much access, but I wish they did, and I think that's something really important to work on, because if you've got those kind of eloquent, persuasive voices within the Jewish community to speak to other Jews, I think that would be really that's very important. And I also think, the organisations that are doing it, like ICAHD, I know a little bit about ICAHD, and I do respect their work, but they have a very particular line, and I think it would, which is a sort of two-state line. So I think if people like Jeff, it would be great to have slightly more radical voices accessing Jewish communities as well.
Okay, thanks. We've really got to stop now, but I want to put one very last question to Jeff. I don't know whether this is intended to be light-hearted, but somebody asked, Jeff, why did you describe yourself as an actor? Now, I read this article. Did they think you meant that you're an actor and you're in the Shakespearean sense? Maybe you are. Or did I misunderstand? I think you said we must all be actors. And then, if you were going to advise anyone on a particular kind of action, would, writing a letter to an MP, how high would that be on your priority? Just briefly.
Well, all the world's a stage. I meant actor in a political sense. I see myself as a political actor in the sense of having agency, trying to affect policy, trying to not as an actor in that sense. You know, and then the question, because it goes back to the question that I raised before, how does civil society insert itself into a political process? You have to try everything. I mean, I go meet parliamentary members, I go meet the Foreign Office, I know it's not going to change anything really, but you've got to kind of do it, and sometimes you find an opening and somebody's interested. You know, writing letters it's important, just from the point of view of keeping the issue on the map. But I think in the end, it's going to be. I think there's going to be a combination of a trickle-up effect. You know, as public opinion changes all over the world, really, it's trickling up into the governments, and the governments are, you know, even these things that I don't completely support, but they're okay in a way of parliaments recognizing Palestinian sovereignty and that. I mean, those are good things too in a way, but they show that there's a trickle up. And then but I think something major has to happen, like the collapse of the PA or something, to really make the situation intolerable. And then that combination of that urgent need to address a meltdown situation with the preparation that we've done in terms of our lobbying here and there to at least soften opposition will help to create that coming together. But the third part that really we have to do is we have to be actors, we have to formulate a just solution. You know, the governments are not going to do that. And if we don't do it, and we should already have, we're in a limbo now. Nothing's happening. This is an opportunity to strategize, and we're not talking to each other. Palestinians aren't talking to Israelis because of this anti-normalization thing, and Palestinians aren't talking to each other. So in this whole space we have, nothing's happening, and I'm afraid you're going to have collapse without agency. And if an opening's going to appear, and we're not really ready for it.
Jeff.
We should have a kind of a freedom charter. You know,
I think you're taking us into a whole.
Okay, but anyway, but
the whole next year of discussions about what should be the vision moving forward. So, but that's great. Sorry to cut you off. Just let me to thank. I found this very enlightening. I hope you have too. So maybe we could just give. Thank you.